So we're going to try and get started tonight and on our discussion. Tonight we're talking about Bible inconsistencies. So we've talked about a lot of different Bible difficulties along the way so far. And this list is what Donald Morgan considers to be inconsistencies, which he kind of question, he doesn't say these are contradictions because he's careful not to say that, right? In fact, here's what he says. I think I gave this to you in your notes. He offers a disclaimer, as he has in many of the sections. He says, even though accepted and common definitions of the two terms often make them synonymous, inconsistencies do not necessarily equate to contradictions. Mm-hmm. An inconsistency involves a lack of harmonious uniformity, regularity, steady continuity, or agreement. Thus, a contradiction is necessarily an inconsistency, but an inconsistency is not necessarily a contradiction. So if that sounds like legalese to you, someone trying to hedge their bets, I would say, yeah, that's exactly what it is. Because by inconsistency, well, he doesn't want to say contradictory. That's clearly what he intends. It's clearly what he thinks this is, or at least likely is. And he counts, he lists, but my count, I didn't count this twice. He lists 328 of these. Okay, so this is by far the longest list of any of them in his document. He lists 328 places that he considers the Bible to be inconsistent and possibly self-contradictory. Now, the question, and this is important, so I think before we get into it, just this is simple. I think the question that we have to ask is not whether there are any statements in the Bible that may appear to be inconsistent. Because when you read through the Bible, there clearly are statements in the Bible that appear to be inconsistent at first glance. That nobody disagrees with that. There are things as you read them, you read this and you go, what? How much? That's kind of make you scratch your head, or you wonder, you puzzle over it. Nobody disagrees with that. So that in and of itself really isn't the issue. The issue is whether those statements can be reconciled reasonably. I mean, do we have to, just ignore them and pretend they don't exist? I don't think so. The question is, can we reconcile them with a reasonable amount of effort and thinking? I mean, again, let's be fair. And let me just say this. As a general rule, I think this is true. We should not assume that someone is being inconsistent or contradicting themselves when they make two statements that are not immediately reconciled. I mean, I think we should give people more credit than that, generally. I think we should give people credit that they kind of don't make a habit out of contradicting themselves all the time. Now, some people may, all right? But at least at first glance, we should give people that much credit, shouldn't we? We've tried to do that here with Donald Morgan. I think we've tried to give him enough credit to assume that he means what he says and that he's not intentionally trying to contradict himself at any point. The problem is, I think that oftentimes Bible skeptics don't do that. They don't really argue in good faith. They pretend to be in good faith, but they don't. They assume the worst rather than accepting reasonable explanations. Because the fact of the matter is, I think probably, like I said, I didn't look at all 328. There's a lot of them. I didn't look at all of them in detail. I just glanced at them. But I think we could reasonably answer these supposed inconsistencies that Donald Morgan brings up. But the question is, would he even accept our explanations if we said, well, there's a reasonable answer to this? And I would say probably not. That's the reason he has this list, because I have no doubt that people have already, over the years, I mean, I told you this, he's managing this for 20 some years. Obviously, the assumption is somebody along the way has disagreed with him, and he's dismissed their reasonable explanation. And that, to me, is acting in bad faith. Because it's one thing to bring these up and say, hey, this seems to be inconsistent. Okay, but if an explanation then is forthcoming as to why it's not inconsistent, we ought to accept that. At least we ought to at least try, and it ought to be reasonable. So I think, of course, as we've already seen, that the skeptic in general is not really interested in reasonable explanations, as much as he says he is. And so what do we do? How do we answer these? Well, usually what we do when a person makes two statements that appear to be in conflict, we usually ask them, right? What do you mean by that? How do you explain that? Well, obviously the authors of the Bible aren't around for us to ask. However, we can ask them by examining what they wrote and seeing if it does reconcile. That's really what we're going to do. And of course, that's what we've done with all these other ones. And we've found as we've done that all of these supposed fatal Bible flaws and all the other things that we've looked at, they all just come to nothing. But let's try that with this. So I used a random number generator again to pick 6 examples. I don't know if we can do all 6 tonight, but I'm going to try because we don't have time to do this next week. So because next week we got to talk about vulgarities and questionable questionable rules or laws. It's not the word he uses, but anyways, whatever. We'll talk about that. But let's look at these. So first one we have Genesis 17, 20 and 22. So 3 references there in Genesis. And he says this: Abraham and his half-sister Sarai are married and receive God's blessing. Okay? And we don't have to look all of this up, but Genesis 17 and Genesis 22 are both passages where God specifically pronounces blessing on Abram and Sarai, or Sarah, that saying that they're going to have children, right? He's going to bless them. And chapter 20 is interesting. Chapter 20 is when Abraham and Sarah are in Gerar, and Abimelech, the king there, takes Sarah into his harem because, of course, Abraham has told Sarah that when they travel anywhere, she is to tell everyone that they are brother and sister, right? So, and Abimelech takes Sarah into his harem, and then it's discovered that she's actually Abraham's wife. And of course, that's because God does this supernatural thing and explains that. So Abimelech confronts Abraham. Remember what Abraham says. He kind of stumbles around, which is usually what we do when we're caught, right? He kind of stumbles around and he hems and haws and he goes, well, she is my half-sister, after all. It's not totally a lie. So, okay. So Abraham and Sarah are half brother and sister, right? Now, look at the other passage. So these are the ones we want to examine tonight, really look at, because this is where the crux of the issue is as far as Donald Morgan is concerned. Leviticus 20 and verse 17. Okay, let's see. Michael, why don't you, if you're there, why don't you read it for us? Leviticus 20 and verse 17. Just that one verse will be enough, probably.
If a man takes his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter, and sees her nakedness, and she sees his nakedness, it is a wicked thing, and they shall be cut off in the sight of their people. He has uncovered his sister's nakedness. He shall bear his guilt.
Okay, so Leviticus 20, verse 17, also Leviticus 18, also Deuteronomy 27, he references here. And simply, Morgan simply notes incest is wrong. Okay? Because here we have this very, very clear statement. If a man takes his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter, and sees her nakedness, and she sees his nakedness, it is a wicked thing. So what we have in multiple passages, Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, Deuteronomy 27, we have multiple passages where there is very specific laws given regarding relationships between, the best way to classify it would be first and second degree relations, okay? Because it lists a bunch. This only lists 1 or 2, but the other passage in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy lists a whole bunch of other relationships, but it basically kind of boils down to either immediate family, first degree, or second degree. So it's that next step beyond immediate, it's grandparents or grandchildren or aunts and uncles. Like it's but it's like that those 2 circles immediately around the person, right? And there's a prohibition, absolute prohibition of those things. So what are we supposed to make of this? I mean, incest is wrong, and I mean,
years later, that's allowed.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, you have to bring that up, right? Okay, so, we have this rule, this works, we have this concept in our American justice system. In fact, it's even written into our Constitution. The concept of that laws do not operate ex post facto. Anybody know what that means? Anybody remember from your civics class in high school what ex post facto means?
You can't apply a law to some event that happens before the law was given.
Right. We don't enact laws after the fact and then apply them to something that happened before. So you can't go out there on Highway H and put up new signs that say the speed limit is 25, which would be a crime, by the way, if they did that out here. But I shouldn't say that because somebody might get the idea. But if you and then you come in and say, yesterday you were driving 45 out here. I'm going to give you a ticket for 20 miles an hour and over. I'm going to take away your license because you're driving 20 miles an hour over the speed limit. We can't do that because yesterday the law was 45. So yesterday I was in compliance with the law. So the fact that you change the law today doesn't mean my behavior yesterday was criminal, right? That's what that whole concept means, ex post facto. That after the fact, you can't make something illegal. So as Greg pointed out, Abraham and Sarah, we're talking about 400 years before the law of Moses. So these laws that are written in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy come 400 years after Abraham and Sarah are off the scene. So it's not valid to take laws that are written 400 years later and reverse apply them. Now, there is a legitimate question, though, because aren't the laws of God eternal, unchanging? I mean, aren't they based on God's unchanging character? And if the laws of God are based on his eternal, unchanging character, then aren't his laws unchanging and eternal? Doesn't that mean it's always been wrong for a brother to marry his sister or some close family relation like
The
that?
question I would have is, how many generations after Noah would this?
Exactly.
Abraham,
After Noah,
Sarah,
after Adam.
Because obviously,
Because
Noah's children, Noah's, grandchildren had to, marry.
Okay.
Close.
So you bring up a very good observation that we also need to recognize. But before we get to that, because that's part of the key, before we get to that, let's consider something else. In the New Testament, Mark chapter 7, let's do that. Mark chapter 7. This is worth looking at just for a second. Mark chapter 7, verses 18 and 19. Somebody want to read that when they find it?
And he saith unto them, Are ye so without understanding also? Do ye not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him? Because it entered not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all meats.
Into the what?
The draught. Okay, what's verse? What did I say? 18 and 19? Yeah, what does verse 19 say?
I went into verse 19.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
purifying all meats. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what is Jesus saying here?
Yeah, that's what I was
Okay,
wondering.
here's what this has to do with that, right? Jesus was declaring all foods pure here. Like Mark is noting that here.
Spiritually pure.
Mark is noting that the idea of the impure, the idea of the impure foods is no longer valid. In fact, there's actually textual variant here because that's why the King James reads the way that it does, and the New King James because they follow the textual variant. The New King James has a marginal note, if you look at it, that says the final phrase of Mark's comment is set off that Jesus has declared all foods clean, because there's a variant there in how that's worded. But the idea here is that what Jesus was doing is Jesus was saying all foods are clean, and we know that because you go to Acts chapter 10, and what does Peter see? The vision, right, of the sheet coming down from heaven, and God says, kill and eat. And Peter says, oh, I won't ever eat anything unclean. And God says, what I've called clean, don't you call unclean. And Peter realizes, if you read through Acts 10 and 11, it makes it very clear, Peter realizes that it dawns on him what has happened. after the fact. And so the truth is that, and how does this relate? Well, here's how this relates. Because it's true that all of the laws of God are based on God's character, which is unchanging. But that doesn't mean that the laws are themselves eternal and unchanging. Because the laws fit the specific context in which they're given. So for instance, the law, say not to eat pork, applied in Old Testament Israel from the time of Moses on. But before the time of Moses, there was not a prohibition on that. And clearly after the New Testament time, when Jesus comes and declares all foods clean, and then Peter sees a vision, after that, there's nothing unclean. And so therefore, we don't see a problem. We don't have a problem with eating ham dinner on, Greg having his hot ham and cheese, or us having a ham dinner on, there's a shortage of us having a ham dinner, on Easter Sunday. But the point is, like, there's no, we understand that, right? That law was given for specific context and period of time. Now, what about this? Well, as Sam already pointed out, the sons and daughters of Noah, right? Who would they have married? Well, of course, his sons were already married when they won the ark, but then you go to think, okay, now it's Noah's grandkids. Who did Noah's grandkids marry? Well, at the best case scenario, cousins, if not brothers and sisters. But go back to the earlier issue of that with Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
This, if you remember, was, I think, a big point during the whole Scopes monkey trial, if you remember that story of, who did Cain marry? Who was Cain's wife? And at the time, it was thought that was a slam dunk question against the Bible, because those fundamentalist Christians, a bunch of rubes, they can't answer this question. Where did Cain get his wife? Well, it's not a difficult question. Okay, Adam lived 930 years. How many kids do you think Adam and Eve had during the hundreds of years in which they would have been fertile and able to have children? Lots of children. Where did Cain get his wife? One of them. It's terrible. Well,
How can they say it's terrible? God allows it.
Again, we understand there are cultural taboos here, and there are also today legitimate, kind of genetic reasons why that's against the law and why there's prohibitions on that. Not to mention just the cultural taboos.
But as Christians, we believe that we are a species that started perfect, and as generations go on, become imperfect.
Declined. Absolutely. It fits within the worldview of Christianity to say, those first generations. I mean, how many generations would you have to go before you're not marrying your sibling or first cousin? Well, at least a couple generations down before that is a possibility that you could marry someone that you're not within a first or second degree relation to. But again, it's not so. As you pointed out, clearly this concept of incest being morally wrong is not a permanent injunction by God, because it wasn't the case in instances after creation or after the flood, because it was of necessity. They would have had to marry, for crying out loud, Eve was made from Adam's rib. You don't get closer than that. Okay? Okay. Just think about this for a second. This is God's doing. It's not really a problem here. So I think for all those reasons, okay, the assumption that we can take this incest law and go backwards with it and say it applies to Abraham and Sarah and it applies further back. Now, at the same time, when you read in Genesis, you read about Lot and his daughters, and that the way that account is written, it conveys a sense in which there was an understanding that was wrong, that there was something wrong there.
Also, it was
that
rape.
Is not the case with Abraham and Sarah in the same way. What's that?
It was rape.
Well, yeah, but aside from that, you're right. But aside from that, even the relationship itself is illicit and is seen that way in the text. But Abraham and Sarah is not presented that way. And so again, I think we have to just be careful, as we just said this before, we can't read our culture back into the Bible, but we can't read a later Bible culture back into an earlier one either, because the Bible spans a large period of time. I have to be very careful not to do that. And I think that's the mistake that he's making here, reading from the time of Moses back to the time of Abraham as if these are the same context, and they're not. Okay, so let's continue on. What's that? Oh, Gavin. Yeah, he's having a ball. All right, next one. Leviticus 25:37 and Psalm 15:1 and 5. It is wrong to lend money at interest. Let's go to Leviticus 25. This is interesting. Remember our rule, Nico's rule. We can call it that, can't we? Nico's rule?
Yes.
The Nico rule.
He would be honored.
Context, right? Context. Leviticus 25 and verse 37.
Thou shalt not give him thy money upon usury.
Usury is the term there.
Usury.
Yep.
Nor lend him thy victuals for increase.
Gotta love the old King James.
Yeah, I'm like, what did that say?
Somebody want to read that who does not read in the King James so we can understand it? So
You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food at a profit.
okay. All right. Now, very much pulling this out of context, but in fairness, okay, what is it saying? Usury here is a form of interest. Okay, it's charging someone for borrowing money. Okay, and food at a profit. The idea is that you've got somebody in need and you're loaning him money. You're not supposed to charge interest, or you're giving him food. You're not supposed to make money off it. It's fine to charge him enough to cover your costs, but don't make money off it. Now, this is not a prohibition on restaurants, but if you notice the context here, and again, he ignores the context completely. Notice the context. Just go back 2 verses. If one of your what? Brethren. Okay, keep that in mind. Key. If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him, like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your God, that your brother may live with you. Now he says, you shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food at a profit. I am the Lord, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt.
So it's specifically from poor people.
Okay, well, specifically from poor people, but not just from any poor people. Because he says, if one of your what? Brethren. Who are they?
The Hebrews.
Right, fellow Israelites. Now, how do I know that? Because, again, read the whole chapter. Go down a few verses, down to verse 44. Okay? Verse 44. And, by the way, verses 39 to 43, he talks about what happens if one of your brothers becomes poor and he sells himself to you. He's talking about how they would use, sells himself to you just sounds like slavery, and it's a form of that. But the concept here is, I owe money I can't pay. So what do? I'll work it off. Okay? So I'm going to sell myself to you. And either you're going to pay my debt and then I owe you and I'm going to work it off, or you're the one I owe. So I sell myself to you to pay off the debt and I'll work it off. I'll work as your servant. I'll work for you. Now notice what he says here. Okay, so this is how it's going to work. We'll read this anyways. I was going to skip it, but we should. Okay, because it's interesting. If one of your brother who dwells by you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. Okay. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee, which was every 49 years, you had a year of Jubilee. And then he shall depart from you, verse 41. He and his children with him. So every 49 years, all of these indentured servants were to be set free. So if you were poor, you could pay off your debt by becoming an indentured servant. This is a voluntary thing. Right? Nobody is stealing you and making you a slave. In fact, he says you're not supposed to treat them like a slave, but treat them as a servant. And then set them free. And he shall return to the possession of his fathers. In other words, his debt will be paid off when you get to the year of Jubilee. Right? Every 49 years, the debt's paid off. Verse 42, for they are my servants who I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. Okay. You shall not rule over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God. So there's this, you're not supposed to be the hard slave master, the cruel. That's not this. This guy comes to you, he's He's poor. He's in a bad spot. He needs help. And you help him. How do you help him? You give him a job. He works for you. And he, by working for you, pays off his debt. And you take care of him and his family, and you treat him well. And then when the year of Jubilee comes, you send him out with his family, and he takes back his family's possessions, and they go free. That's a great system. If you get yourself in debt where you can't get out, here's a way out. You become an indentured servant, and you work your way out. Great system. Personal responsibility, accountability, debts get paid, right?
And also at the same time, there's direction given to the people on the other end of things saying, be good to these people.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is not, again, in an ideal world, this is not a cruel system. This is not a system where there's abuse. Okay. I mean, again.
He says treat them as employees.
Exactly. And he's basically saying, remember, I'm God. You better listen because I'm the one in charge of all this. So there's an implied kind of threat here. But then notice verse 44. So this is why we're getting down to this. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have. Notice, he said you can't make slaves. These are your brothers. But notice verse 44. You may have male and female slaves from the nations that are around you. Notice these are not Israelites. From them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, verse 45, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. Here's why this is important. Because there's a different set of rules for the people who aren't Israelites, right? So the Israelite comes to you and he needs money, you loan him money, you don't charge him interest. Your Israelite brother comes to you and he needs food, you sell him food at cost. And you feed him and you take care of him because you care about him, because he's your brother. Now, the Gentile, the Philistine who comes to you who's poor and needs help, you don't have to, you can charge him interest. You can purchase his children and own them as slaves. I mean, that's, again, hard for us to get our minds around that. But this was the difference. You could treat them differently because they were not your brothers. There was a difference of how you treated the Israelites from everybody else. Okay. Now, basically, Psalm 15, 1 and 5 pretty much says the same basic thing. But let's look at one more. Deuteronomy 23. He doesn't mention this one, probably because it blows up his objection, or at least it provides the out here. But look at Deuteronomy 23, because we'll get to the New Testament here in a second. Because he's going to try to say that Jesus contradicts this, or at least is inconsistent with this. Okay. Which is a pretty serious charge, because if Jesus is inconsistent, then we're in trouble. Okay, but Deuteronomy 23, verse 19. So here's where this gets made really explicit. You shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money or food or anything that is lent out in interest. Verse 20. To a foreigner you may charge interest, but to your brother you shall not charge interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all to which you set your hand in the land which you are entering to possess. So two sets of rules, right? No interest for Israelites, interest charged to non-Israelites. Different rules apply. Okay. Keep that in mind. Now, so let's just say that for at the very least, his representation is a little bit incorrect here. To say it is wrong to lend money at interest, the Bible does not teach that lending money at interest is morally wrong. It doesn't. But for the Israelites, they were told not to charge interest of their fellow Israelites. God wasn't saying that interest is bad. God was saying you treat your Israelites like your brother. And you don't charge your brother interest. You loan him money because he's your brother. So you do the same thing with every other Israelite. That's what God was saying there. So again, not a moral prohibition on lending money and interest at all. But, okay, what about Jesus? Jesus in Matthew 25 and Luke 19, it's the parable of the talents. Remember the parable of the talents? And you have the good servant who takes some of his talents and he goes out and he doubles them, and another servant who takes some of his talents and he makes more. Then you have that third servant, and what does he do? He gets that one talent, and what does he do with it?
Buries it.
He buries it. He hides it. He doesn't do anything with it. He comes back and he says, oh, I don't have anything to give you other than what I just have the one talent. And the master says, you are a wicked and lazy servant. You could have at least given the money to the banker and earn interest. So Morgan says, see, Jesus was all for interest and earning interest, and the Old Testament says no interest. So that's Morgan's inconsistency here, he sees.
A little different.
Yeah. Well, anyways, without going into all that, look at, I think I gave you this quote by Michael Wilkins in his commentary on Matthew. And he talks about this a little bit. And here's what he suggests. He actually gives 3 different options for how we understand what Jesus is doing. He says, Jesus is not advocating setting aside the Old Testament law here. Okay. So Wilkins is saying this is not an inconsistency. Okay. Rather, he is referring to investing the talent with money changers. You think money changers, you immediately think the people Jesus drove out of the temple, right? But those are the bad money changers because they were doing their business in the temple, and it was because of the temple tax, and it was a very unjust system where they were requiring people to pay their tithe in the temple currency rather than their own currency, and then they could charge exorbitant, exchange rates. That's why Jesus was all upset with that. Okay, but that's not what these are. These money changers were different. These money changers performed a valuable service, exchanging a variety of forms of currency for those who were traveling through Palestine from the diaspora, which is where the Jews were scattered all across the empire. So Jews would come back through Palestine, and they would come with whatever money they used wherever they lived. And you need to exchange money. Well, we do the same thing today. You go to another country, you got to exchange your money. And there's a rate, an exchange rate, and all that. And the idea is that this guy could have given his money to the money changers, and they would have made money off of it. And he would have gotten a percentage of that through the exchange of money. It would have been a perfectly legitimate thing to do. That's what Wilkins is saying. Now, he offers 2 other possibilities, though. He says, less likely, Jesus may be pointing to the practice of Jews in Palestine charging interest on loans to Gentiles. Because again, that's also a possibility. Maybe Jesus was saying, this guy, you could have charged interest of Gentiles and made some money for him. Or, and this is interesting, given the flexibility with which Jesus used comparisons in parables, he may be using a prohibited practice of earning interest to make a point about a good thing. So it's possible that Jesus is not saying this guy was doing right to earn interest, but using this illustration, even if what the guy was doing would have been morally bad or would have been a violation of the law of the Old Testament, still could have made Jesus' point. So regardless, I think just the whole concept here that Jesus is somehow contradicting the Old Testament here, it's just ridiculous. He's grasping at straws. And again, the idea that charging interest is morally wrong and prohibited is clearly not found. Okay, next one is really quick. Don't even turn there. I'll just tell you real quick. 2 Kings 24:17, Jehoiachin, and then he has Jehoiakim. I think he's confused. Those are 2 different guys. Jehoiakim is actually Jehoiachin's father. So I don't know. But anyways, Jehoiachin, he says, was succeeded by his uncle, 2 Kings 24:17. But 2 Chronicles 36:10, he was succeeded by his brother. What do we make of this? Well, it's actually true. 2 Kings 24:17 says, and by the way, Jeremiah 37:1 says the same thing, that Zedekiah was actually Jehoiachin's uncle. And he was made the king when Jehoiachin was removed from the throne by Nebuchadnezzar. Zedekiah was made the king. He was his uncle. 2 Chronicles 36:10 does call him his brother. So what are we supposed to do with that? Well, the word brother here is a very generic word in Hebrew.
Like brethren, almost?
Well, brethren is just a plural form of that. But brother is very generic. It's used in a lot of different ways. It has a very wide range of meaning. Let me give you a couple of examples. Genesis 4:9, Cain and Abel, right? Am I my brother's keeper? Same exact word, right? Full brothers. No, okay, fine. But you know what's interesting? Genesis 13 and verse 8. This one will get you right here. Abraham is speaking to Lot. Remember Abraham and Lot, they had that point where they had that disagreement and they couldn't get along. And Abraham says to Lot, hey, you know what? We shouldn't be fighting. We're brothers. Uses the same term, same exact word. Here's the problem. Abraham was Lot's uncle. So we have an uncle-nephew relationship, but the term used is we're brothers. And actually, this word brother is used in all sorts of different ways. It's used of people of the same tribe. It's used of generically of all Israelites are to view each other as brothers. It's used metaphorically to just kind of talk about any close relationship or any persons that have a close relationship. David and Jonathan, when they speak of each other, David calls Jonathan his brother. They're not related at all, but they were so close in their friendship that he calls him a brother. So again, it's Proverbs. Remember the verse in Proverbs, there's a friend that sticks closer than a brother. Same word. Again, used in a variety of different ways and contexts. So is there any problem with 2 Chronicles 36 using this generic term for brother to refer to the relationship between Zedekiah and Jehoiakim or Jehoiachin? No. Again, brother it's used a wide variety, and clearly with Abram and Lot, it's used of an uncle and a nephew. So it's just silly to point this out. Or it's not. I shouldn't say silly. It's just not doing your due diligence. Okay. It didn't take me long to find those either, by the way.
Here I was picturing one of those confusing family trees that like everybody's.
Brother is a very wide-ranging term, as is father to some degree. Father in the Old Testament, especially, oftentimes means ancestor, and it can skip. It can be grandfather, great grandfather. It can refer to multiple generations. For instance, in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar is referred to as Belshazzar's father, but we know there was at least one generation between those two. It was actually more likely a grandfather and grandson. But the same term is used because it's just a generic term for, well, when we kind of do that today, back in the era of the founding fathers, we kind of, we don't use the term strictly in a literal one generation removed way, although we do use it that way most of the time.
Or even in the army, they call each other brothers at arms. Sure.
There's lots of ways these relational terms, and again, even in English, even in modern times, we do this, and yet, so it's not a contradiction, okay? It's just not to say that, all right? The next one is also equally absurd. Matthew 10:28 and Luke 12:4, Jesus says not to fear men, fear God only, right? We get that. What about all those times where we read about Jesus hiding, escaping, and going secretly? Boy, Jesus was fearing. Well, again, in order for this to be a contradiction or an inconsistency, he's going to have to show that Jesus was acting out of fear when he hid, escaped, traveled secretly, and not out of some other reason. He didn't have some other reason to do this. Interestingly enough, one of the passages he references here, and I won't look at them all, but John 7, there's something that Jesus says in John 7 is kind of interesting, because Jesus' brothers go to him and they say to him, basically, it's time for us to go to Judea for the feast, for the festival, right? The Feast of Tabernacles was near, and his brothers say to him, hey, it's time for us to go to Jerusalem. And Jesus says this in John 7 and verse 6. Jesus said to them, my time has not yet come, but your time is always ready. He goes on to say some other things. Then he tells them, verse 8, you go up to the feast. I am not yet going up to the feast, for my time has not yet fully come. Kind of interesting. But why is this important? I think what this reveals to us is we need to remember that Jesus' actions were governed by a greater plan and purpose. Here he alludes to that. It's not time yet for me to go. Right? He's saying that I know you guys can go, but my time hasn't come yet. So I'm not going to go. Why? Because Jesus was operating on a different time frame, a different time scale. He was operating according to a particular plan, and that didn't include what his brothers wanted to do here. Now, interestingly enough, just a couple verses later, verse 10, when his brothers had gone up, then he also went up to the feast. Not openly, but as it were in secret. So was Jesus lying? Oh, Morgan doesn't present that here. Was Jesus lying and saying he wasn't? No, but apparently however much time transpired between when he told his brothers to go and then when they went, now it was time. He said, my time hasn't come. Well, now it came because he shows up. Okay. I mean, it's not like rocket science here. He said it wasn't time and then he went later because it was time. But what's amazing to me, and we don't have time to do this, there's some study resources out there that would go through the life of Jesus and kind of timeline some of these things. But really, when you look at the life of Jesus, you gotta appreciate the fact that Jesus he had complete control He came and went where he wanted. He was not going to allow the Jews to take him before it was time, right? So many of the times when he disappeared, and that's where some of these references that Morgan presents, he disappeared out of their hands, or they wanted to kill him, or they wanted to take him, make him king, and he disappeared, and he went about him. He didn't tell anybody where he was going. And why did he do that? Because he was controlling the events, so that when it was time, it would be inevitable. And I wish I had time. I should find it. I've got a link somewhere. Actually, I think I have the files on my computer. Dr. Doug Bookman spoke at our Pastors' Wives Retreat back in February, and he made available a whole bunch of audio recordings of things that he's done where he talks about this. And man, he does an incredible job of showing how Jesus absolutely controlled every single detail of the events. And I don't mean like supernaturally because he's God. I mean like he worked out everything so that everything kind of came to pass so that he would be crucified the day he was crucified, in the time and place, in exactly the way. Everything had to be just right, and he made it happen that way. Again, not because he pulled strings as God, but as a man, he worked out all this stuff, and he crafted it, and he figured it out, and it's amazing. I think that's what we got to understand. Jesus was in control of this. He wasn't hiding because he was afraid. He was simply not allowing the Jews to capture him until it was time, and he was not allowing himself to be discovered until it was time, because he was operating on that plan. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be a bigger contradiction? I'm surprised he didn't use this as a contradiction for someone who claims to be God running around and hiding.
Yeah.
Like, that seems like the bigger thing for him to pounce on.
It's interesting how many times he's touched on one thing and seemed to ignore something else that, at least to me, seems like a more legitimate question to bring up.
Right.
But you know.
And then when he knew there was a trap, he boldly walks in.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, we got two more. Let's just try and touch on these really quickly. I don't know. Do you have a preference? The next one is Jesus' resurrection appearances. The last one is Paul's the chief of sinners. John says that the children of God do not sin.
I mean, the second one is something we cover weekly, so I think we should go for the first one.
I have here.
Okay. All right, so let's think about this. So he's got three references from the Gospels. Matthew 28, 8 and 9 says Jesus' first resurrection appearance was fairly near the tomb. Matthew 28, 8 and 9. You should read these because you need to read them to see if what Morgan is saying is really accurate here according to the text of the Bible. And Matthew 28, right at the beginning, you have the ladies who come to the tomb early in the morning on that Sunday morning, right? And they meet the angel there. So look at verse 8. So they leave the tomb after seeing this angel. Verse 8, they went out quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to bring his disciples word. And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, rejoice. So they came and held him by the feet and worshipped him. Now look at how Morgan describes that passage. He says Jesus' first resurrection appearance was fairly near the tomb. What do you think? Does Matthew 28 give any indication as to the location of this particular
It's within running distance. That's kind of what he's probably getting at.
within running distance?
Yeah. He ran to bring his disciples words.
Okay. But
Really?
these are people who are accustomed to walking everywhere.
Yeah.
So what is running distance for them? I don't know. It may not be that close.
About 12 miles.
Regardless, is there really anything in the text that speaks about where this took place? Really nothing. Is there anything in the text that says, by the way, that this was the first resurrection appearance? It's the first one Matthew mentions, but does Matthew say this was the first time someone saw him after he was raised from the dead? Nope. Okay, so I think it's possible that Morgan may be overstating a little bit what this is saying. Let's look at Luke 24. Luke 24. verses 13 to 15. And of course, Luke 24 begins the same thing, right? Some women came to the tomb early that Sunday morning. They find the stone rolled away from the tomb. They don't find Jesus. They see the angel. The angel talks to them. And says here that they go and they tell the apostles, and then Peter goes and he runs down to the tomb and he sees the grave clothes, but again, nobody sees anything, right? Now, verse 13. Now behold, two of them were traveling that same day to a village called Emmaus, which was 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they talked together of all these things which had happened. So it was, while they conversed and reasoned, that Jesus himself drew near and went with them. Okay. And what does Morgan say about this? It was in the vicinity of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem.
Why can't the tomb be near Emmaus? I mean,
But
7
they're not
miles
in
isn't
Emmaus,
very
they're
much.
traveling to Emmaus.
Okay. Yeah, they're not in Emmaus at the beginning here anyways. They're traveling to Emmaus, which means you get on the road and you get on the road in Jerusalem and you head out of Jerusalem toward Emmaus, and it's a 7-mile walk. Okay. So in fairness, I would say, yeah, that seems to be a slightly inaccurate representation here. But does this say anything about whether or not anybody else maybe saw Jesus that day? Nope, no reference. Doesn't say this was the first instance of anyone seeing it. Doesn't say this was the only instance. Doesn't say there weren't other instances, right? So again, I'm not really sure how this and Matthew 28 relate to each other in this, other than the two times where Jesus appeared to people on the day that he rose from the dead. But neither one of them necessarily indicates that it is the first or that they're, which one. What about John 20? So let's go to the fourth gospel here, John 20. John 20, verse 13 and 14. Okay, John 20, verse 13. Then they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" This is Mary. We find out later on, back in, or down in verse, where is it? Verse 18, that this is actually Mary Magdalene. Obviously, there's 6 different Marys identified in the New Testament. So a lot of Marys to
It's
keep
a
up with.
very popular name.
Which, interestingly enough, is actually the word Miriam. It's not Mary at all. I'm not exactly sure why we go with that, but that's what it is. So anyways, we're stuck with that. But regardless, okay, verse 13. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Verse 14. Now, when she said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there and did not know it was Jesus. Okay. So here's what Morgan says about that. It was right at the tomb. So again, any indication here in the passage that this is I mean,
earlier it does.
well, okay, so he's Jesus, so he could appear in all these places without any problem. Okay, that's not an issue. But is there even anything in the text to tell us that one of these was the first one, or this was? I mean, it would be different if Matthew had said the first person who saw Jesus was this, and John said the first person who saw Jesus was this, and it was 2 different people. That might be a little bit difficult to reconcile. But here we have 3 different appearances, by the way, to 3 different groups of people. Because in Matthew 28, it's the women, plural, who have come and are leaving to go tell the disciples, and on their way to tell the disciples, they see Jesus. In Luke 24, it's 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, and again, we don't even know who those disciples were. We have no idea. Or exact, we know it was that day, but it was sometime that day, but it doesn't mean it wasn't later on that day. And actually, it was later enough in the day that it got to be nighttime. Remember, because they were there and it was like, hey, we can't go. He wanted to keep going, and they said, no, come in and have dinner with us. So it was dinner time. It was nighttime. It was evening when they got to Emmaus. So that would suggest it was already later in the day. So again, we're talking about these are different times of the day, no problem. And different people. And then John 20 is Mary Magdalene. So just think about this, right? And this is where I don't understand why Morgan would bring this up, because we have 3 different appearances to 3 different groups or individuals that include 3 different sets of details. Isn't that what you'd expect if there were actually 3 different appearances to 3 different groups of people at 3 different times? Like, you'd expect the stories would be different. I mean, if they copied, it would be like, if everybody copied from the same story, you'd kind of expect them to all be the same, but they're not. Well, that kind of actually makes it sound more genuine than if it was, it's like, I go, I don't understand the objection here. I really don't. I don't understand why he thinks that there's any inconsistency here whatsoever.
Because the first account
Mentioned.
Yeah.
As if we're supposed to think Matthew and Luke and John are saying this happened, then immediately this happened, and there was no break in between, nothing, as if this was a strict chronology. And yet we know when you look at the Gospels that they don't present a strict chronology. So again, yeah.
And we know from Acts that Jesus appeared to several different people.
Oh yeah.
Later on,
and then in
too.
1 Corinthians, he appeared to multiple people. Paul's text about. So we have lots of different appearances of Jesus to the disciples, to different disciples, different groups of disciples at different times over a course of 40 days. But even the day of, clearly there were multiple appearances to different people. And there's just no contradiction there. It's just not. And the only way you would think there was is if you're assuming something about these texts that none of them say. And that's just not how you read anything, especially not how we read the Bible. Okay? But I think that's what we're seeing, is that there is a desire to find an inconsistency. And if you can't find one, you'll make one. Because that's really what we're seeing with all of these, I think, is a willingness to read and assume that there's an inconsistency, assume that the authors are contradicting themselves, rather than recognize every single one of these can be reasonably reconciled without any problem. There really is just no reason for us to consider this to be problematic at all. And I think, again, he's only got a couple of swings left, okay? Because we got to look at Bible vulgarities and bad laws or whatever it is that he said, so-called, to see, because he struck out on all the other ones. And again, I don't say this to make fun of him. I say this to demonstrate, as we look at what the Bible says, and we look at the objections that are brought against it, what we see over and over and over again is there's nothing there. You start digging a little bit and they just disappear. There's no substance there because there is no real objection. Okay, and over and time again, the Bible proves itself to be true. And that really, to me, is the conclusion we have to come to. So, any questions or comments here as we're closing? All right, I think everybody's pretty well done with that. So, all right, thank you.